Alrighty, let me make sure this is recording and we will jump right to it. Okay, appears to be recording. Okay, that was all. Alrighty. Hello again. Welcome to lecture 2. I have held my end of the bargain. I have a podcast uploaded for each chapter of this week. And so herein lies where you discover that I'm not going to lecture about these chapters verbatim. That's redundant. It's a waste of your time and a waste of mine. And that really isn't my purpose as an instructor, right? To waste your time. So we're going to jump right into a companion lecture, right? Because my lectures are companions to the text and to the curriculum I have laid out. As such, because we're not in a situation of an open forum where we can actually abide by an open forum. For me, this feels very much like lecturing at you. However, I think I'm going to fix that. I have asked, and I think I'm going to somehow commandeer a room. And at least once in the next 2 weeks, if not once per week, I'm going to commandeer a room, fingers crossed, where you can choose to come. It will not be required before you freak out, right? I will record it. But those of you who want to meet, who want to throw questions at me in person, who like to see their instructor pivot, all about pivoting. So bring it on, right? We can actually conduct a lecture with more than one person in the room, right? Those are my favorite, I have to confess. Now, our next few chapters kind of already gave you a run through. We discussed marriage and family, and we discussed thinking outside the box and challenging ourselves and critically thinking, right? An application of theory. And here, my friends, is where the rubber meets the road. Because first question I'm going to pose to you that I want you to mull over, it's controversial. Absolutely. I think I already mentioned I'm unorthodox, but if you haven't figured it out yet, today is that day. And that question is, who taught you how to love? I know that seems like an inanely easy question. Very simple, right out the gate, right? What is love? This concept. Why would you ask that? Oh my gosh, I was scared there for a second. I thought it was going to be a hard question. I actually heard kind of all the above in person. But that is your own bias, right? Because you're assuming you are interpreting that question through the bias in which you define love, right? Many of you may think I'm talking about the emotion. And in fact, I'm actually referring to the relationship. Some of you won't even concur or have never thought that there might be two separate perspectives on love, one as an emotion and one as an actual relationship. I want you to close your eyes, okay? And I want you to picture in your own mind your perfect relationship. You don't have to think too hard, you don't have to get too elevated, but at some point, I think all of us in any situation has experienced something that has called to mind how we definitively define, imagine, or illustrate that concept, right? And once you have it in your head, I want you to ask yourself where that picture came from, right? Why do you envision it the way you envision it? Did you learn it from your parents? watching their relationship. Nothing wrong with that. Did you learn it from Disney? Right? Aging myself, but millennials grew up on Disney, right? We are Cinderella, full fashion, Snow White girls. Snow White's a little older than us, but it was my favorite, right? Beauty and the Beast, right? Adaptations of different love stories, right? Not all tragedies, mostly happy endings, right? I say not all tragedies because Bambi's parents die. Okay, that's a tragedy, guys. I'm sorry. I'm just kidding. But not as another love story, though. Some of you that may not have jumped to the forefront of your minds, right? But that's a story of maternal love. That's a story of a child's love. And that is the story of communal love, of friends, the love we have for friends, the support network that they can provide, right? Some of you may say religion, right? There are many concepts and many expectations within love. There are many facets that can determine, depending on the community you live in, what creates your illustration or your mind's eye and perception of love, or creates in your mind's eye your perception of love, right? Movies, rom-coms, tragedies, books, book talk, TikTok, grandparents, experience in our own relationships, trauma, hope, resilience. I mean, we could really go on for days in that concept. But I think each of us, when I ask that question, who gave you that picture or what gave you that picture, something pops up to us, right? And that's the one I want you to dwell on. You really critically analyze everything that's every influence that's helped, mm, let's say, construct your image of what the perfect relationship looks like. We could probably be here for the next 20 years, right? Because lots of things, if not everything I even listed just now, right? All together, combined, collectively, could be considered an influence in our idea, our constructed concept of love, right? Not as the emotion, right? Because there's that too, but as an ideal, right? Because in that perfect relationship, most of the time, I won't say all of the time, but most of the time, we think as love, or at least we think of love as being a required component. It needs to be present for that image of a perfect relationship to actually work out in our head. Now, how we define love, that's why I separated it from that notion of emotion, right? Now, when we say it has to be present, most of us do share that idea that love has to be present to make a relationship work. However, what kind of relationship did you picture? Maybe some romantic, maybe some familial, maybe some professional, maybe some, I mean, the list goes on. And some of those may sound strange to you, but there's no wrong or right way to picture your perfect relationship. The difference here is how love is defined, right? Love may be present, but is the same definition of love, what one imagines to be that necessary ingredient, right? Some people feel that selfless love is what's needed to be present to create a perfect relationship, right? Some people, some people think soulmate love, right? Undying, everlasting love, right? Some people think that's unrealistic. You know, only realistic love leads to a perfect relationship. right? Imperfection is perfection because it means you're accepting people as they are, not placing undue burdens or unrealistic expectations on them within the relationship or on each other, so to speak, right? But really, what I'm getting at is not necessarily how to define the perfect relationship, but I wanted that in your head while we go down this rabbit hole. Love is learned before it's experienced. One of the biggest misconceptions I think people have is that love is natural, right? Attraction, maybe, attachment, probably, given some of the experiments in psychology. But relationships and how you navigate them, that's learned, right? Before any of us date, we've already spent thousands of hours watching relationships, whether it's our parents, our friends, our older siblings, what's on TV or movies or series or social media, especially nowadays, right? Social media, those Instagram perfect, presentations of family. Sometimes, you have that one person who's always posting all the happy moments. And, you know, this is one of those, this is one of those times I've learned, I am just different. I am built different than the rest of the world. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, fortunately for my children, I guess that's still up for debate. But I had a friend who we have a mutual friend, and that mutual friend is always posting some fantastic things, family trips, right? Honor roll, awards and FFA, um, promotions. I think that's just recently. Renewing vows. Always pictures of happy together family. And she was like, I'm so sick of that. I'm sick of it because it makes me feel bad about my own relationship because mine's not perfect like that. And I love both my friends. I should start with that. However, I also know them both well enough to know that none of our relationships are perfect. And what my friend posts is what she chooses to share with the world, which is fine. I was raised in the era my mom said you don't air your dirty laundry, right? And my other friend really, she goes a different route on social media, right? She likes to post whatever she wants, whatever is occurring to her, whatever emotion she's feeling, you know about it, right? Because she's documented it on social media. And no shade in that direction. But social media is a platform that each individual is allowed to determine and experience and navigate of their own volition, their own beliefs, and they're allowed to go their own way. No judgment. I want to be clear about that. This is just a story, right? But me, being a psychology major, looked at her and I said, "Why are you jealous? You are sitting at the same table I am when she is complaining about the fact that he doesn't help clean, that he doesn't show for the kids from event to event, that she has to argue with him because he's always so tired because he works out in a oil field, right? Um, to go to any of the events when he's home and she's frustrated and she doesn't feel seen or heard or appreciated." But you wouldn't know that from her Instagram, right? And it's fake and I don't appreciate it. And again, being a psychology major, I just chuckled because, you know, I post what I want to post. I post enough. I don't post too much. I have my own measurement of what's right and what's just right. Let's say I'm a Goldilocks. It's my nickname in my friend group, right? Everything for me has to be just right. The conditions, the circumstances, the people you've invited to your barbecue, because if there's some people that I just have to spend a whole day avoiding, I'm not coming. Like that's just me. It's who I am. It's one of my quirks, right? But I am an absolute Goldilocks, right? I eat my food when it's just warm enough, not when it's too hot. That is probably the epitome of that metaphor, but it's legit true. And in context of my friendship, I am. I am not the friend that coddles you. I tell you like it is, and I warn you in advance. Do not bring anything to me if you don't want to know what I'm thinking, because I'm about word vomit. It's coming out. No filter, word vomit, and a California attitude. Whew. It hurts a lot of feelings sometimes. I'm not gonna lie. I apologized a lot in my life for being who I am, but that's because my mama says she's probably right that in being myself, I have to consider the other person across from me less, right? And if I consider them more and put their needs and wants and what will hurt them beforehand, then I am probably diminishing myself. It is a thin line for all of us to walk, right? Especially in relationships. Because when I talk about relationships, while many of us may have jumped to, right, I wasn't necessarily only referring to a romantic relationship. All relationships are difficult to juggle, right? I tend to be, in my friend group, I tend to be the words of wisdom, tend to be the one that they roll ideas off of, and I am the one that says, absolutely not, that's insanity. Or, girl, please, you're not doing that. You're full of it, right? Or even, you know, hey, listen, that sounds impossible, but it's not. You put your mind to it, you can get it done. I believe in you. And all of us in relationships offer different things, right? My friends for me are my validation, one of my vulnerabilities, because this is marriage and family, I can share this, is motherhood, being a single mother, right? My ex was an addict. He's been clean for 6+ years now. He's even a supervisor, has held down the same job for as many years, I believe. But it wasn't always that nice. And I have lots of trauma from that situation. But I try not to raise my kids in the shadow of that trauma. And that for me takes a lot of putting what I feel, or what I think I feel, or my undealt with emotions and resentments and traumas in the back seat. Is that healthy? Absolutely not. And I do not recommend it, but I do not believe in lying to my class. So this is in the interest of full transparency because that is the core of my existence, right? Is for me, motherhood. I could probably fail at everything else, and though I might be disappointed and I might lament, I might regret, I would be fine. I would figure it out, put my big girl pants on, put my cowgirl boots on, and move forward. Failing at motherhood terrifies me. I think that would probably cripple me. It is my vulnerability, right? So for me, my friends are the ones that remind me that motherhood is just another relationship and it looks different for everyone, right? The things I do, the way I raise my children, I do what works for us. And that was something that took me a long time to come to, right? People, most of my friends are in a relationship, right? Usually with the father of their children. All right. I have seen happy marriages, happy parental partnerships, right? And then I've seen divorces with crazy co-parenting. And I don't mean to infer that the parents are crazy, but sometimes when resentment on both sides of the line refuses to relent because people don't deal with their issues, that can cause some calamity, right? So after those versions of modeling co-parenting when my ex approached me. For me, I thought it was best for my children to be able to, or what they could, appreciate and enjoy having two parents active in their lives. And that was my choice. I'm not knocking anybody who didn't make that choice. What I'm sharing is that that is a choice that is an ongoing vulnerability, right? Because I am still validating that choice every single day by how I interact, how I co-parent. He was just recently married. He's doing very well. Very proud of him, actually. But that has changed our dynamic. We had established a dynamic, and we started getting on really well. Started creating positive and equal force. I mean, I won't say equal, I'll probably do more for the kids than he does, but for me, it meets the requirement. I'm a little OCD and I like that little bit of control. So doing everything 50-50 would probably drive me a little more nuts than what I'm at right now. But getting married created a third person in that dynamic. Me getting engaged created a fourth person in that dynamic. And he and I are trying to traverse this along with our partners, right? They have their own dynamic, perspective, and struggle, right? And we are all trying to learn this. And each and every single one of us has had a different experience, has had different versions of relationships or different models of relationships that we grew up watching and learning from and emulating, right? Because you model what you know. And sometimes I think that gets my students. And if that hits a sore spot, I completely understand. Some people think when I say that I'm saying that we are destined to become our parents. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if all you ever know is one sort of thing, it influences whether or not you act that way. If you like it, you adopt it. If you don't, you go out of your way to avoid it, right? But either way, that particular experience has influenced how you navigate your own relationships, whether that's acquaintances, friendships, familial, or romantic, even professional, right? Because early jobs, sometimes watching some of your managers, especially if it's something, a place we didn't want to be, right? Wasn't our goal. I think sometimes that we learn modeled behavior from even that experience. Again, social media, movies, things that we don't realize are so influential, but that we engage in or touch down and are surrounded by or immersed in daily, right? That, of course, is going to have an influence whether we cognitively recognize it or not, right? We're building an internal blueprint without even realizing it. All of these experiences, right, start to structure a modeled behavior, right? These internal models or attachment expectations, they may come from different sources. And from a sociological lens, right, we're not asking about the consciousness of it, right? We're not even really focusing on that except for when we're making connections to our own lives, right? But from a sociological lens, we're approaching it from this idea of where did these models come from? Where did this idea come from? Where does this picture, right? Or is this illustration or image that we've built or we covet, where did it come from? And interesting enough, the way I like to define relationships is we don't just choose partners, we don't just choose friends. Unfortunately, we can't really choose colleagues, right? I don't mean that we have terrible colleagues. I'm actually blessed. In this particular job, I have amazing colleagues, but I've also had other jobs where they were less amazing. But what I'm saying here is when we do get to choose, we choose stories, right? We choose the people that make us laugh, that give us good memories, who and like that dopamine kick when we get around them, right? We try to surround ourselves with people we like to be around. And I think quantifiably, this is where we come into conflict internally when we have family members that some of us have family members that we don't quite click with. They don't make us feel good. Going home for us or holidays for us can be a burden. They can drain us emotionally, physically, mentally. On the other hand of that, some of us love to go home. It lifts us up. It fills us. It satiates that void, right? It patches it up because without them, we feel a little less like ourselves. All of that is okay. There is neither a wrong way or a right way to feel in that situation. Because again, we come back to this concept that every person is an individual and our experiences are unique to us, right? And our interpretation is unique to us because our interpretation is based on our experience, because experience influences how we perceive the world, how we perceive our relationships, how we perceive ourselves, right? Sometimes we can be right with everyone in the world except with ourselves. And that does just as much damage and can make us feel just as isolated. Now, in terms of what is a relationship, I want to pose this question to you because now that we've kind of dug deeper into this and kind of shared ideas, and again, this is an online class, but only as an online class, but I am challenging in a way that allows you to navigate this in a private space, which makes it an even safer space to ask ourselves these questions, right? But when we look at what is a relationship, that sounds obvious. Absolutely. But is it really that obvious? How do we answer? How would each of you define what is a relationship? And that's without looking at how the book defines it, right? I want to know. Think about that. Challenge yourself. How would you define a relationship if you had to explain it to somebody who lived on Mars and came and needed to know what that meant? What would you say to someone with no prior foundation in our society or in a global society, an international perspective, right? Because culturally, that question can change. So I would say that bias can control how we define it, right? Bias as in our experience and our culture and the way that we expect to be loved, interacted with, and treated, right? Because interacted with is not necessarily treated, right? If we were using words to describe it, now this is all in your head. You don't have to write this down unless it's something that strikes you, per your assignment. But this is what we're doing. We're digressing. We're going to kind of dissect this notion, right? Is marriage about love? I skipped a step. So, is a relationship something that leads to marriage? Is it marriage? Does anything outside of marriage actually constitute a relationship, right? Are we using the word relationship too loosely by applying it to professional interactions and friendships? And should we just call them friendships, right? Acquaintanceships, whatever, right? I want you to think about that. Companionships, right? And then I want you to come back and think, is marriage about love? If marriage is the it thing, if marriage is in fact what a true relationship is in the romantic context or in any context, if you are one who shares the mentality that anything outside of marriage should be constituted as an actual relationship, right? There are separate names for them and they should remain divided in that. Okay. Companionship, friendship. Um, there's another one, but it just slips my mind. Again, human. Been at this too long, been awake too long, apparently. But again, what about children? right? Are familial relationships just as important as romantic relationships? And if so, where do children factor into that, right? What about siblings? In a marriage, is it about companionship? Is it about partnership? That was the other one, partnership, right? Is it about tradition? Is it about security? Is it about procreation? Is it about financial or fiscal considerations or elevation, right? Is it an identity, right? Is it a status? Have you succeeded as an adult in society's eyes if you have attained a degree, gotten a job off that degree, gotten married, and had children, right? Is that or is that not definitively how society measures your success? Do you have 2.5 kids? Do you have a home? Do you own your home or do you rent? Do you have a car? Do you have two cars? Right? How new are your cars? What can you afford? Are you living paycheck to paycheck or are you stacking money in the bank? Right? Where does the line begin and end when you think about what defines that word? Relationship, the significance, the meaning, right? And the definition, because truthfully, those are all three different things in this context. Now, interestingly enough, as we go into chapter 7, when you're looking at it and you're listening to the podcast, this is when you really start to go down the rabbit hole of what marriage represents. Historically, it started as a contract. Now, that sounds cold. Of course, in some contexts, it could be, but in reality, it was a contractual agreement made to protect two parties, right? To continue the lineage of one, right? And to guarantee a lifelong support system for the other. Now, do we like to look at it that way? Absolutely not, because we live in a modern age, right? But that idea is still present. You know, when people have children out of wedlock, people are still looked at negatively for that, right? When someone says they don't want to get married, and I can speak from experience on that because for a very long time, that's what I said. I had children out of wedlock. I had a degree. I have two masters now, but before I acquired those two masters and elevated myself in society, I got many looks for that, both from my peers and from others. You know, those older than me, those younger than me. Right? Why would I make that choice? That didn't make any sense. I was ostracizing myself in society. While I may not be a pariah with a scarlet letter, you know, that would still affect me. And it did. I won't lie. We act like we live in a modern society, but the truth is, there are still things out there that are influenced by decisions like that, having children out of wedlock, using IVF, um, being married and in an open relationship, right? Things that go against the grain of normalcy or otherwise diluted as tradition, right? We parade a lot of expectations that society holds as tradition. So if you're going against the traditional norms, then you are moving against the grain, which is always interesting. But that is such a closed interpretation and narrative of marriage. Marriage has never been static, right? It's evolved alongside society. It's moved from institutional contractual agreement to compassionate declaration of love and even more recently, individualized custom ideals of marriage, right? Same-sex marriage, etc., and so forth. We won't go down that quite yet, down that rabbit hole quite yet. But I think the question that I want you to answer, to consider, right, is if marriage has changed this much in only a few centuries from a contractual obligational agreement, right, that was beneficial in different ways to two parties, although it is often portrayed in media, and I won't disagree, but it's maybe villainized a little more than it needed to be. But, in essence, women only had one choice, right? Whereas men had a little more wiggle room. But the truth is, what people don't think about is marriage was just as beneficial for a man as it was for a woman, right? Well, it created a sense of support for a woman. So her parents wouldn't um, have to worry about when they died, her losing property and becoming destitute, no matter how wealthy she was, right? Marriage guaranteed not just his lineage, but it absolutely guaranteed that society would recognize his children. And for a man, that was invaluable because a man's responsibility was an heir, right? That is the whole point of continuing on the lineage, is the idea of the heir. And so many people think of it in terms of, well, that was such a categorical violation of women in that era. But in relation, it protected both men and women from the scrutiny and the, the cruelty that society of that age had to offer. Given that marriage has changed in just these few last centuries from that idea to a more modern application or execution, can we actually say that there's ever really been one correct definition of that word slash relationship? Now, that's kind of a question I want you to mull over, and we'll probably come back to that later. But we're going to dive into a different section right now, okay? Because we're moving forward out of the idea of relationship versus marriage and, what constitute the difference between how you define a relationship and how you define marriage. Now we're just going to really focus in on marriage, right? And what creates a successful marriage? And is your idea, I want you to stop and ask yourself, what is a perfect marriage? And is when you stop and think about that, does that picture match your idea of a perfect relationship? And if so, is that a coincidence? Is that a correlation? If they're opposing or they don't match, what is the reason for that? These are all things I want you to, food for thought, as I like to say, be chewing on, be snacking on while we move forward, right? Because in this section of chapter 7, we're looking at expectations. Expectations of society are everywhere. And these expectations condition us, even subconsciously, right? Just being exposed to these expectations, right? Well, that generates some conditioning, and thus some of those same expectations are rooted within us because, you practice what you know. In a lot of ways, just my personal opinion, I think expectations are the real villain in many relationships. I think they're probably the root cause of why some work and some don't. Not because expectations or having them are bad, but mainly because they're invisible, because they're not tangible, because they're subject to interpretation, right? When you think about when you get in a relationship, right? If you've been in a relationship, do you expect your door to be opened? Does everybody open their own door? Who cooks dinner? Who apologizes first? Who manages money? Who makes the money, right? Who disciplines children? Who raises the children? Who interacts with the children? Who asks someone out? Who says I love you first? Who buys the engagement ring? Who takes whose last name? And yes, it is perfectly legal. It's just a common tradition. But when you get married, you A, don't have to change your name, and B, a man can take a woman's name. Yes, that goes against the expected tradition and the historical tradition, but that's always been the case. Interestingly enough, I always found that so fascinating. Anyway, we will not get on a tangent. We will keep moving forward, right? I want you guys to think about this. Oh, who changes diapers? That's a good one because in my relationship with my children, that was one I'd never thought about. And that was definitely one I was caught off guard about. Not because I didn't expect to change diapers, but because I didn't expect it would be considered by my partner to only be my responsibility. And that was something I had to negotiate, right? I had to navigate that and other things. But that is, I think, the first time I ever realized that the difference in which at the time, my spouse and my children, I won't say spouse, my partner, right? Because most people think spouse, think marriage. Okay. Since we're talking about marriage in those terms, I will just say my partner, right? At the time, and I were raised differently. I never really thought that would make a difference because I didn't care how he was raised. I loved him, right? And I expected him not to care how I was raised, for him just to love me. But it is in those little moments that things like that begin to make a difference because we had a different view. Of course, sure, some of you soon being raised in California, I was raised that both parents should be changing diapers, a 50-50 partnership, right? Both of you hold each other up. If it needs to get done, who's ever closest, whatnot, that's what gets done. And my partner was raised in that's a woman's area, right? You're in the kitchen, barefoot, pregnant in the kitchen. That was literally what I was told. Now, while that may be funny and something you all may have heard before, in a literal sense, when I was personally faced with that, I couldn't have found it more offensive if it was told to me in my first language. So that had a lot of trouble acclimating to that, right? It is, as my mother said later, it is always this heroic idea of love conquers all. And in reality, it's expectation that conquers all, right? The flexibility to change your expectations that creates longevity and the inability to bend, to yield, that negates it, right? Causes, and as they like to say in some divorces, irreconcilable differences. Now, I don't laugh. I'm not laughing at divorce. What I'm laughing at is that particular term. It always makes me giggle because a lot of those oh gosh. Okay, I've hit my end. It is now 6:43 p.m. and I am crashing. But anyway, and the inability to reconcile, right? These gosh, I don't know why my brain will not function and say that word, but in the inability to reconcile, essentially, you get to the root of that problem and all of these ideas. If I think couples had really sat down and been honest and transparent in the dating process, they never would have ended up where they are right then. Now, that's not to say there's another interesting concept that I want you to think about because people change. You are not subject to remain the same person. And you enter a relationship with someone and you're married to them for 15 years. And at the end of that 15 years, neither one of you may be the same people that you were to begin with. In fact, you've given experiences and traumas, tribulations, triumphs, elevations, advancements, both the good and the bad, right? You shouldn't be the same people at the end of that, right? When you come back and look at yourselves 15 years later, you should be evolved people. And by evolved, I don't mean necessarily better. I just mean that if you remain the same the whole entire time, at some point you have to have barriers, isolating, avoidant, whatnot, right? There's absolutely no flexibility in your existence, right? But 15 years down the road come and you decide, you know what, I'm not the same person. I've changed. I don't, what connected us before no longer connects us, and you go your separate ways, right? Again, expectation, being on the same page, communication, transparency, willingly, willingness to yield in some contexts, to compromise, to stand up for yourself, to set boundaries, right? These all fall in the category of expectations. But for the most part, a lot of decisions, a lot of roles that people take on in their relationships on who mows the grass, who does the dishes, who washes the clothes, who puts them away, who vacuums the floor, who mops the floor, right? These are things that most couples never consciously decide themselves out loud. It's just somebody does it and the expectation for repetition and routine begins to build. Is that wrong? Not necessarily. I like to tell people in parenting, in relationships, in marriage, in school, in career choices, you do what works for you. You do what you need to do. In a relationship, just because it doesn't look like, you know, um, right now, Bridgerton, or um, the campus show on Amazon Prime. Just because it doesn't fit that socially portrayed expectation doesn't mean it's wrong, right? But some people get caught up in the optics, right? They try to live a life that measures up to what often I consider to be unrealistic expectations and modeled outcomes for relationships. For me, what I always find interesting is when you watch a show about like a rom-com or a love story that has more than one sequel, right? That has a sequel period. I find that the first one's always that happy ending. And then the next one is always about the trials that they don't tell you about after the happy ending, right? And how couples come to, you know, coexist, live together, compromise, whatnot, raise children. And then, but there's usually always some sort of barrier put in there, whether it's another person, whether it's, them forgetting that they love each other, or I'm trying to think, that was like knocked up. I think that was her, I think it's her sister and her husband that end up taking a separation for a bit because I nearly get divorced because they decide that they're different people and they don't love each other like that anymore. Now, is any of this wrong? Absolutely not. The point that I'm getting at here is there is an influence of unspoken expectations. And now, cognitively, we don't always think about that. We don't think about what our behavior may say to our partner, what the things we don't say, how they can speak louder than things we do say, right? The things we don't do. Some people like, let's talk about love language, right? There's this movement where you need to identify your love language, and some people are really into it and some aren't. I actually think identifying your own love language is good, not necessarily because you then have to find somebody with the same love language, but because that says that you know yourself. And that helps you develop expectations and communicate them in a more transparent manner, right? Instead of, your partner having to guess how they can validate you and how they can show you their love and how you can receive it, right? Because say my partner, right? My partner doesn't remember dates, is unable to remember birthdays and anniversaries and other things like that. But his his acts of love and validation, shine through because he has taken the time to figure out what my love language is, what I need, right? And a lot of people forget that the whole concept behind love language is not to match them up and not to have somebody know them because them actually asking or knowing their love language means that they know them better and that they're a better partner, but it's for communication purposes. You take the guessing out of it. You give your partner the advantage of being able to give you what you need and what you want, right? And that's important. And I find that interesting because what do we do when we date? Are we always 100% honest? Do we sometimes exaggerate to make ourselves look better? Um, do we bend a little bit more to another person's preference? Like if they prefer to go bowling, then go to the movies, but we would prefer to go to the movies than to go bowling. If we're not verbal about that, right? Then we get in a relationship and somewhere in between when all the newness falls off, then it's like, why are you always taking me bowling? Well, I thought you liked bowling. Well, I don't. I never did. And then it becomes for that person, well, that was kind of dishonest, right? That kind of catches them off guard. I mean, this again is a scenario, but food for thought, right? Presentation affects perception and interpretation is guided by experience. These are things I want you to consider when you look at relationships and marriage, right? Expectations kind of a representative of an invisible contract. Every relationship has one, right? Nobody signs it. That's why it's an invisible contract, but everyone has one. It sounds something like a good husband mows the yard and takes out the trash. A good wife keeps the house clean and raises the kids and still manages to work full or part-time, right? A good mother would never want a break from her children. So having her partner help her is really just adding insult to injury and making her look like a bad mom. Or a father ought to teach their son how to be a man, right? I'm not saying any of this is true. I'm not saying any of these are common perceptions. These are examples that just come to mind from media and social media, right? I'm talking about memes, I'm talking about TikTok videos, I'm talking about different series that kind of promote these particular roles and gender constrained roles, right? Because these roles are basically assigning expectations to a wife or a husband or a father or a mother, right? Now, interestingly enough, right, we talked about you model what you know, but not all of these perceptions may come from our parents or our friends or our immediate social interactions, right? Most of them come from observation through media, through public discourse, being at a zoo, watching a husband lift his pregnant wife up into a little tram, right? And then wrangling all the kids, right? And sitting with the kids and carrying the backpack, right? All while they're trekking across the zoo, things like that, right? That reinforce these observed behaviors and expectations, right? Because the behavior is what's observed, the expectation is what's inferred. And I want you guys to make that connection. Now, that leads me into this idea of parenthood. This is such a hard area to traverse, right? I guess the question I really want to pose first is when does parenthood begin? at your child's birth, during pregnancy, once a couple gets married, at the desire for children, at conception, um, at the first act of fiscal responsibility, identity. Now, I say this because having kids in and of itself is an act that is a social expectation. When you get married or when you have kids out of wedlock, I can speak on that more thoroughly, right? People ask you, when are you going to get married? And when you get married, people ask you, when are you going to have kids? It's cyclic, right? And it's a societal norm. Now, do people necessarily mean harm or mean to infer that you're not eating, you're not cutting the mustard sociologically when they say, when are you having kids after you get married? No, our grandparents, because there are some out there who say, when am I getting grandkids? Are they meaning to be negative overtly? Absolutely not. But it's the unspoken things, these messages, right? These very much, we can say subliminal, I would say subliminal messages that are being inferred when you ask these questions because they bring up a thought process. Well, I'm married and we're not having kids yet, or couples who have trouble having kids. That is, you know, they're trying to get pregnant. Somebody says, so when are you having kids? That's kind of a trigger question. I've seen it in action. But more importantly, sociologically, I think the better question is, when do you decide to have kids? When is it prudent? When is it fiscally responsible? When is it emotionally and mentally responsible, right, to make this decision? You can know, you can desire to have kids, but the actual decision to have kids, right? Is there a checklist? Should you have should you have attained a certain level in life before you have kids? Or is that unfair to the children, bringing them into a circumstance where they don't have all the advantages that they could have? Again, I'm not saying any one thing over the other is correct. I am presenting conflicting rationales and perspectives within these societal norms. Because even these expectations, as clear as they are, create conflicting perspectives. And that creates internal conflict in ourselves, in our relationships, in our presentation, and sometimes in our wants and needs, right? Because I may want to have children, but I may also decide that I'm not ready. And I may not want to have children, but I may also know that if I don't, then I may not hit that mile marker that considers me fully successful, right? It's that nuclear family that doesn't exist anymore from the 50s. 2.5 kids, white picket fence, two-car family. You got that? Then you're successful, right? Because that says you're at a point where the bank will loan to you. You are advancing the next generation. You have done something with your life. You are at a point where society can have no qualms with you. Now, the book mentions something it kind of makes me chuckle, and I won't say in a dark way, but it makes me chuckle at the irony of the situation because the book kind of talks about the idea of people asking you when you get married, all of a sudden, when are you having kids? And the rarity of people actually asking you, why did you decide to have children? And it kind of presents it as this idea that one of those questions about parenthood is expected, right, when you get married. right? And the other is optional. They're assuming that that parenthood itself is optional. And that is actually an excellent example of sociological expectation, a bias that the book presents that I don't think the authors realized, right? Because that's culture speaking, right? Is asking one, so why did you decide to have kids? Is that really saying that that was an option for them? It can be interpreted in so many different ways. That can be interpreted as, well, I don't think you're a very good parent, so why did you decide to have kids? Or you never wanted this before, and then all of a sudden you have kids. Why would you decide that? Right? There are so many ways to interpret questions like that. And I think that kind of brings us into the culmination, let's say, of chapter 8, right? Is parenthood natural? Is it social? Is it cultural? Is it all of the above? Right? And why does every culture parent differently? And they do. I actually will, I have to find it, but I'm going to post a PowerPoint that you guys can go over on different parenting techniques that are actually correlated to different cultures. Like, for instance, parents of Chinese origin are called tiger parents. And there's dolphin parents, panda parents. I mean, you can Google all of that. There's another whole rabbit hole, but it's a type of parenting and how that progresses, how that impacts your children, for instance, right? How that impacts their perceptions, their success in life. So, and really what that breaks down to in the ideas of different parenthood, it's not different levels of nurturing or different levels of love. It's different approaches for different ages, different expectations culturally for different ages, different discipline methods, different sleeping arrangements, different schooling expectations. Um, you know, I think that most basic concept really comes down to this idea that we just kind of put to the, back of our mind, but biology, genetics, right? Procreation gives us children, but society teaches us how to raise them. And I don't mean that as society acts as a teacher. The expectation of a society that we both grew up in and that we are currently in when we choose to have children, actually have them, that influences the way that we will inevitably raise them. And I want you guys to think about that. That being said, since we're discussing parenthood, let's talk about this very novel concept these days. But what makes someone a parent? DNA, love, proximity, responsibility, the level of fiscal responsibility, right? Like if a mother is only living off child support, but caring for the child, 24/7, who is the parent? Who is the better parent, right? Or is there a better parent in that scenario, right? Because they're both fulfilling different obligations and different needs of the child, right? One's fulfilling the fiscal responsibility that comes with raising a child, and the other, the nurturing and interaction slash behavioral model required for raising children, right? But is the time each parent spend with the kid, is that what determines what a parent is? How much one sacrifices over the other parent, right? Let's do a quick thought plot, right? I want you to imagine two adults, right? One shares DNA with the kid, and the other has raised them, has been there, present for them, fiscally and emotionally for 15 years, right? Which one would you consider the parent? This is a controversial question. because some people think this answer is overtly obvious. And really, this is one of those questions that is very telling of either how we were raised or our own experience as a parent with co-parenting or with with a partner that we parent with currently, right? It's not an easy answer. It seems like it's an easy answer, and social media has lots of memes that tell us it's an easy answer, right? But that's exactly why sociology studies families. And so exactly why we have a course like marriage and family, right? Because we don't want to assume biology tells us everything. We don't want to assume that culture tells us everything. We don't want to assume that societal expectation, right, gives us everything we need to know about parenting. We need a holistic perspective, right? And I would say that when we approach parenting in this class, rather than adapting to our own biases, I would challenge us to step outside of our bias, step outside what we know, what's familiar, what we've experienced, or what we've observed, right? We want to understand this idea, maybe why that this chapter actually emphasizes parenting as a social environment and a caring relationship that isn't completely built on a foundation of genetic material, right? It is holistically, again, nature and nurture, right? You have a collaboration in this situation of both because the environment and the genetics play an influential role in the upbringing of a child. Let's think about parenting styles. I'm thinking when you're looking at the influence that as a parent you provide to your child, whether that's a working role model of behavior or that is a model of behavior of what not to do, right? And it's hard. It's a fine line. I won't say I've never modeled behavior for my children that I would not care for them to carry on, right? I'm human. We're all human. And I think therein lies this unspoken difficulty when we're contemplating this concept of parenthood. We don't want to fail. And so we really hate when there are weaknesses found in our parenting skills. But realistically, nobody's perfect. So I don't know that anybody can really be honest with themselves and evaluate themselves as a perfect parent, right? I mean, anyone is free to evaluate themselves as a perfect parent, but I think they do themselves a disservice, right? Because that's an ongoing process, right? And if you have multiple children, you're dealing with different personalities and so many things come into play. Are you being fair to each child? Are you letting each child be themselves? Are you coercing each child to be who you want them to be? Are you letting them coerce you by not providing boundaries or not disciplining in a, let's say, corporal punishment, you know? So these are all things, especially if you're considering a family, if you have a goal of family, or if you are currently in the midst of raising children, you know, building your family. These are things I want you to think about, right? Because these matter. These are perspectives that I want you to consider, right? We live in this modern era and so many changes are occurring. We used to have this idea of this nuclear family. That was perfection. Leave it to Beaver type stuff, right? Two-parent households. Only one parent had to work. Owned your home. Could be one car, could be two-car family. 2.5 kids and a white picket fence, right? And very clear and defined roles for each parent, although they were based on gender, right? And so I guess my last question that I'm going to pose to you today in your food for thought would be, given that we have evolved away from the nuclear family into something completely different, which we will discuss as we get there, right? Who is raising children today? Is it really the parents, considering that most even two-party households have to work constantly, right? Is it schools? Is it TikTok? Teachers? YouTube? Friends? You know? The book portrays that as really none of those answers are wrong. And that kind of scares me a little. I don't know about you, but influence in parenting has never been more decentralized, more chaotic, right? And that in and of itself kind of serves as a problem. So to circle back, because I'm about to end this lecture, right? So let's digest that. I'm gonna give you a minute to digest that by kind of going on my little exit spiel, right? This is probably how we're gonna conclude this. We'll come back to it, but I guess the note I want to leave you on is I feel like from that notion, that idea that there is now a multifaceted array of influences in parenthood, good, bad, and ugly, right? Once again, I think this brings us back to nature versus nurture. Are we born knowing how to parent? Is that inherent? Are some people just born good parents and others struggle with it because it's unnatural for them? Are we born knowing how to love romantically, familially, let's say friendly? I mean, just however you define it, right? However you want to look at it. Is that inherent? Is love inherent? Is the ability to love inherent? And are we capable of attachment? Or is that something we learn? I'm sorry, are we born capable of attachment? I think I'm over here and my mouth is moving faster than my head, but you know, are we born capable of attachment? Psychology would say yes. A sociological lens on those types of questions would suggest that societies build based off attachment, right? Marriage, dating, friendships, networking, aka professional attachments, right? Gender roles, parenthood, expectations, right? And expectations vary from culture to culture because every culture builds something different. In other words, I really think this lecture comes down to how how do we navigate the struggle, the trial and tribulations, and the barriers that pop up when we are trying to define something like relationship, marriage, love, parenthood, right? This is something I want you to take with you. You know, again, I want you to focus on the idea of expectations, how that concept permeates through each one of the things we've discussed today, right? Every relationship you've ever been in has contained three units: you, your partner, and a collaboration of every expectation you or them brought into the relationship. Sometimes these expectations come from healthy families, sometimes from broken ones, sometimes from religion, from culture, from movies and media, from pain and trauma. Probably the greatest gift of using a sociological lens is that we use it to learn, not necessarily control or coerce behavior, right? Sociology does not tell us what a family should be. It asks us instead to recognize the things we call normal and evaluate or analyze whether these are learned or inherent traits, right? We gain the ability to examine them, to challenge them, to renegotiate them, and intentionally pursue relationships that reflect our own values, right? Not just simply repeating the patterns we inherited, the patterns we've observed, or the patterns that society and its expectations try to coerce us into living, right? Hope you guys have a great evening. Please remember tomorrow sometime I will be posting the next reassignment. They will not be due this week. Please don't freak out. I'm posting them now so you can get a look at them, get a start on them, right? Because this week's assignment is pretty easy, right? I'll get that discussion started as well. But I am not going to bed. I'm going to go home. I'm going to cook dinner for my little children's, try to be the best parent I can, spend some quality time, and get back to this tomorrow. And I wish you guys a very excellent afternoon.